At 73 years old, I watched my own son slide a sealed envelope across the mahogany table in the boardroom I built with my bare hands. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with politeness, so rehearsed it almost sounded professional. "The board has voted. It's time for new leadership, for modernization." The room went quiet. Every man and woman at that table, people I'd hired, mentored, protected through oil crashes and bankruptcies, avoided my eyes. On the wall behind Evan, a gold plaque still read, "Grant Energy Corporation, founded 1981. My name was carved into it. Walter Grant. And just like that, my own son fired me from the company I started in a one-room trailer 42 years ago. He didn't call it firing, of course. He called it a retirement of dignity. There was even a press release drafted. Evan had written it himself. After decades of service, our founder, Mr. Walter Grant, has chosen to step down to make way for a new generation of innovative leadership. Chosen to step down. I could have laughed if it hadn't burned so much. That night I packed what little he'd left me, my wedding ring, a pair of boots, and the old leather-bound engineering journal I'd carried since 1975, and headed for the door of the mansion I built for our family. Evan followed me out with that same PR smile. "Don't take this personally, Dad," he said. "It's just business. You built the foundation. I'm building the future." He waited for me to thank him. Instead, I handed him the house keys. "Careful, son. Foundations can crack if the next generation builds too fast." He smirked, then shut the gate behind me. The click of that iron lock echoed louder than any explosion I'd heard on a rig. I walked away without looking back. 73 years old, cast out of the empire I built from calloused hands and sleepless nights. Now let me stop right here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you raised, someone who once called you hero, turn around and erase you from your own story? Because if you have, then you already know the taste of betrayal isn't sharp. It's slow, metallic, and it lingers. I am Walter Grant, born in Odessa, Texas, son of a truck mechanic and a church singer. I worked 40 years in the oil fields, from the Gulf rigs to the Alaskan pipelines. Every scar on my hands paid for the life my son grew up in, private schools, summer homes, and the Stanford education he now uses to humiliate me. They call him Evan Grant, CEO, visionary, the face of modern energy. I call him the man who forgot who lit the first flame. I spent that night in a motel off I-45, the kind where the carpet smells like coffee and diesel fuel. I sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through my old journal sketches of drill heads, pipeline maps, handwritten notes from my wife, Grace. On one page, she'd written, "Faith will outlast ambition." She was right. Everything Evan had, his suits, his cars, his glossy magazine features, stood on top of my labor and Grace's prayers. But as I stared at that line in her handwriting, I realized something. God doesn't make mistakes. Sometimes he lets the proud rise high enough to see how far they can fall, and I decided I wouldn't stop him. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you raised to continue your dream, you already know what kind of fire burns in your chest. Stay with me, because this story isn't about revenge, it's about revelation. That night, I closed the journal, said a quiet prayer, and whispered to my wife's memory, "Grace, I won't fight him with anger. I'll let truth do the heavy lifting." The next morning, I bought a cheap cup of gas station coffee, drove to the outskirts of town, and unlocked the doors of an old metal building that hadn't been used in 20 years. The workshop where it all began. The air smelled of oil and iron, familiar, honest. I placed my journal on the workbench, rolled up my sleeves, and smiled for the first time in months. Because Evan Grant had just made the worst mistake of his life. He'd forgotten that the man who builds the foundation usually keeps the blueprints. I spent that first morning walking through the old workshop, brushing dust off machines that hadn't been touched since my wife's funeral. The sunlight came through the high windows in gold slants, turning every floating speck of dust into something holy. On one of the shelves sat a small wooden cross. My wife Grace had carved it by hand, the year we nearly lost everything to the oil crash of '86. I ran my thumb along the grain and remembered what she'd said when I told her we might go bankrupt. Walter, she'd smiled. God doesn't waste pain. He just recycles it into wisdom. That line had carried me through decades of storms, but never had I needed it more than now. Evan's betrayal had torn through me deeper than any business failure ever could. Money I could rebuild. Pride I could swallow. But a son's contempt that leaves a hole no paycheck can fill. I sat down on the old stool where I'd drafted my first pipeline design and let the silence settle. Then I opened my wife's Bible, the one she used to read aloud every Sunday morning while I brewed coffee before church. The page fell open to Proverbs 16:18. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. I read it 3 times slow, until the words cut through the ache and landed deep. I realized then that I didn't have to seek revenge. I didn't have to fight him with lawyers or shout in matches. God was already setting the stage. I just had to keep my faith steady enough to let it unfold. Because pride, like Evan's, always writes its own ending. That night I went back to the motel and made a list in my journal names of men I'd worked beside, engineers who still respected the old ways, and one lawyer who owed me a favor from decades ago. Not for vengeance, for truth. I wrote one more line beneath the list. Let him see what happens when God gives the humble the patience to wait. I prayed then not for Evan's punishment, but for his clarity. Lord, I said quietly, I raised him the best I could. You gave him a sharp mind, but somewhere along the line he forgot what you meant by success. If it's your will, let him fall just far enough to see you again. It wasn't an easy prayer to say. Forgiveness never is. The motel room light flickered, and for a moment, I could almost hear Grace's voice again, soft, steady, reminding me that faith isn't shown in how loud we pray, but in how calm we stay when everything else shakes. I turned off the light and slept with that thought. The next morning, I put on my old denim shirt and boots and headed to the diner down the road. The same one where I'd signed my very first drilling contract 40 years ago. The waitress, an old friend named Carla, blinked in surprise when she saw me. Walter Grant, she said. Heard your boy took over. You holding up, I smiled. Better than he will, she laughed. That's the old lion I remember. I didn't tell her that I was already setting something in motion, that while Evan thought I was a relic, I still owned something he'd overlooked: faith, patience, and the quiet backing of men who still believed in handshake deals over press releases. When I stepped outside, the morning air felt cleaner somehow. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry. I was centered, resolved, because I understood what my wife had meant all those years ago. God doesn't waste pain. He uses it to polish the soul until it reflects truth. And somewhere deep down, I knew Evan's pride was about to meet that truth head on. I got in my old Ford pickup, turned the key, and smiled as the engine roared to life. There's something about the sound of a machine that's been through hell and still runs smooth. It reminds you that endurance isn't glamorous, but it's holy. That morning, I whispered one last prayer before driving off. Lord, give me the strength to let him fall, and the wisdom to catch him when he finally looks up. And with that, the road ahead didn't look like an exile anymore. It looked like a mission. 2 weeks later, I stood across the street from what used to be my home, the white stone mansion I'd built for my family 30 years ago. Back then, it was a place filled with oil-field laughter, Sunday dinners, and the smell of Grace's pecan pie drifting from the kitchen. Now it looked like a showroom. The wrought iron gate bore a new gold sign, the Grant Innovation Estate. I watched from my truck as a line of black sedans rolled up the circular driveway. Men in $1,000 suits stepped out their shoes, polished so bright they reflected the Texas sun. Waiters carried trays of champagne through the courtyard I'd once used for family barbecues. And in the center of it all stood my son, Evan Grant, MBA, CEO, visionary. He wore a custom navy suit, white pocket square, and the smirk of a man who thought money made him bulletproof. A photographer from the Houston Chronicle followed him around like a shadow. Smile for the legacy issue, I heard her say. Legacy. That word hit like a nail through the heart. Evan was hosting what he called the New Era Gala, a networking event, to introduce himself as the modern face of Grant Energy. He'd invited investors, tech moguls, and even a senator. The invitation said, "Private residence of Evan Grant, private residence." He'd erased my name from everything, the company, the home, even the mailbox. I could have turned away right then, but I stayed. Because sometimes to truly understand how pride kills you, have to watch it feed itself first. The valet opened the passenger door of a Bentley, and a woman in a diamond-studded gown stepped out, Tiffany Lowe, Evan's new fiancée. She'd been a corporate lawyer for barely a year, but had already posted enough power couple photos to fill a campaign ad. Evan kissed her hand like they were royalty. "Welcome to our empire, darling," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Empire. He'd built nothing. But he believed the lie anyway. Inside the mansion, I could see lights flashing from the chandelier, the one Grace had chosen herself, in a small antique shop long before money came. Evan had replaced the dining table where we used to eat Sunday roasts with a marble bar and 2 mixologists. The crowd laughed at his stories, clinked glasses to his ambitions, and nodded when he said things like, "My father had the heart of a builder. I have the mind of a businessman." I clenched the steering wheel, but I didn't move. A young reporter asked, "So what's next for Grant Energy?" Evan smiled for the camera. "Next," he said, "we transition from old world oil to clean energy innovation. I'm selling the original field properties and reinvesting in modern tech. The past built the platform. The future will build the wealth." Selling the original field properties. That meant the rigs, the workshops, the land where my men bled and sweated through 40 years of storms. He was going to sell them to an offshore conglomerate that would shut them down and gut the workforce just to make himself look green for the press. I'd seen greed before, but never one that wore my last name. The reporter pressed on. "And your father's role in all this?" Evan chuckled. "Dad's enjoying retirement. He's old school. I'm trying to modernize our brand. I'll handle the legacy from here." Handle the legacy. That was the moment I realized my son didn't just want success. He wanted to rewrite history and erase the man who built it. I sat there in silence until the crowd cheered for his toast. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, the one my attorney had given me years ago. It held every document proving ownership of Grant Holdings Trust, the parent company Evan didn't even know existed. He'd been CEO of a surface company. I was still the owner of the foundation beneath it. Have you ever watched someone take credit for everything you built, thinking they're untouchable? Stay with me, because pride like that always has a bill to pay. The gala lights sparkled in the distance, but I didn't feel bitterness anymore. Only a strange calm, like a man who's seen the tide coming long before the boats realize they're sinking. I started my truck and drove toward the refinery district. The men who still called me Mr. Grant would be there, the welders, the engineers, the old friends who understood what loyalty really meant. It was time to wake the sleeping side of Grant Energy, the side that didn't need magazine covers or Harvard credentials. I looked once more at the mansion as I turned the corner. The glow of chandeliers spilled across the driveway like molten gold. It was beautiful. But beauty built on arrogance never lasts long. And Evan Grant was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The next morning, I stood at the edge of the old refinery yard, watching the sunrise bleed across the steel and rust. The air smelled of oil, iron, and memory, the kind of scent no cologne can ever replace. It was the smell of honest work. 3 of my oldest men were already there: Ray, my foreman since '92, Luis, our best driller, and Hank, a welder who'd lost 2 fingers on my watch and still called me boss. When they saw me, they went quiet. Then Ray said, "Heard about your boy Walter. Guess he's gotten too big for his boots, huh?" I gave a small smile. "He's not a boy anymore, Ray. He's a man, just not one the good Lord's finished shaping yet." They chuckled, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh men use when they smell a storm coming and already know what it's going to destroy. Inside my old office trailer, dust coated everything. The air was thick with history, hand-signed paychecks, photos of our first rig, a yellowed newspaper clipping from the day Grant Energy struck oil in the Gulf. I dropped my briefcase on the metal desk and pulled out a folder labeled Grant Holdings Trust. Ray's eyebrows shot up. "That the thing you mentioned back in '08, I nodded. "Yep, the very one." Grace and I made sure this company's roots went deeper than the branches. Evan thinks he owns the tree, but he never once thought to check who owns the ground it's growing on. Hank whistled. "You mean he's sitting in your chair and don't even know you still own the dirt under it?" "Exactly." I spread the papers across the desk: ownership layers, licensing rights, the mineral deeds, the trust agreements, everything Evan had never cared to read. His arrogance had blinded him to the one lesson no MBA teaches: never underestimate the man who built what you're standing on. Luis shook his head. "So what now, boss?" "Now," I said, signing a few papers. "Now we let him keep digging. The deeper he goes, the harder he'll hit the bottom." That afternoon, I drove downtown to see Sarah Keaton, my old attorney. She was pushing 70 herself, but sharp as ever. "Walter Grant," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I was wondering when that boy of yours was going to let his ego outrun his brain." I slid the trust file across her desk. "Time to make sure all the locks still hold." She flipped through the documents, eyes scanning each line. "Everything's solid. Evan's got management rights but no control. You still hold the majority through the trust." "Good," I said. "Then let him feel comfortable a little longer. I want to see how high pride can climb before gravity reminds it who's boss." Sarah smirked. "You want me to start the audit?" "Not yet. Let's see how loud he wants to brag first. That night, I parked across from the mansion again. Through the tall windows, I could see Evan pitching investors selling off every legacy field we ever built. My father's generation meant well, he was saying. But this isn't the age of roughnecks and grease. This is the era of visionaries. Visionaries. I almost laughed. God gives some men sight, others just mirrors. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. Start the audit. Quietly. When I hung up, I sat there a while watching the lights glimmer through those tall windows. Somewhere deep inside, I could still hear Grace's voice. The Lord has a way of bringing proud men low, Walter. You just stand still long enough, and He'll do the heavy lifting. She was right. I started the truck, took one last look at the mansion, and smiled, not with anger, but with certainty. Because I knew what Evan didn't, foundations don't fall apart overnight. They wait until pride gets comfortable. Then they crumble. Have you ever watched someone take credit for everything you built, thinking they're untouchable? Type 1 if you're still with me, because this story's about to reach the part where God starts collecting the debt of arrogance. And believe me, my boy's about to pay it dollar for dollar. As I drove off, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Not the peace of surrender, but the quiet steadiness of a man who knows judgment doesn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes it comes from the truth finally standing back up. And this time, truth was wearing work boots. The Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Houston gleamed like a cathedral built for money. Crystal chandeliers hung above imported marble floors, and waiters in white gloves floated between tables serving champagne that cost more per bottle than a roughneck's monthly wage. It was called the Energy Reimagined Gala, Evan's masterpiece, his grand coming-out party as the new face of American energy. He'd invited senators, investors, tech billionaires, the whole Texas elite. A banner at the entrance read, "Grant Energy from Legacy to Leadership." Legacy. He liked that word. It sounded cleaner than theft. I walked in just as he was greeting guests wearing my old black suit, the same one I'd worn to Grace's funeral. The staff didn't stop me. No one questions an old man in a room full of money. I kept to the side watching as he took the stage. Cameras flashed. His fiancée Tiffany smiled like the Queen of Houston, all diamonds and ambition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evan began, voice smooth, confident. "Tonight isn't about the past. It's about the future. Grant Energy is evolving. We're moving beyond oil into a clean, innovative era." Polite applause rippled through the room. He waited for it to die down before continuing. "My father," he said, glancing around the crowd with a charming half-smile, "built this company on hard work and grit. But the world doesn't run on grit anymore. It runs on vision, on intelligence, on evolution." Some people nodded. Others looked uneasy. And tonight, he said proudly, "I'm signing a partnership that will redefine what this company stands for, a $500 million merger with Titan Global Energy." I felt my pulse slow, not quicken. Titan Global, a foreign conglomerate known for buying American fields cheap and outsourcing labor. Evan was selling our people, our land, our legacy, all for a headline. Then, from the side of the room, a man in a gray suit stood and whispered to Evan's assistant. She hurried over to the stage and passed him a phone. He frowned, glanced at the screen, then looked confused, because the text on that phone read, The majority shareholder of Grant Energy Holdings requests to be present before any contract signing. His head jerked toward the back of the room where I was standing. When our eyes met for a moment, time froze. "Dad," he muttered into the microphone, the sound accidentally carrying through the speakers. Laughter rippled uncomfortably through the audience. I walked toward the stage, slowly, each step echoing off marble floors. Evan tried to regain composure. Folks," he said with a nervous chuckle I wasn't expecting. Clearly, I said, my voice calm but firm. Then again, pride rarely expects company. The crowd went quiet. Even the champagne glasses stopped clinking. I stepped beside him, looked out at the crowd, and said, "Evening, everyone. My name's Walter Grant. I built this company when it was nothing but an idea, a borrowed rig, and a prayer." I turned toward the investors. "And before anyone signs anything tonight, there's something you should know. Evan Grant doesn't own Grant Energy." A collective murmur swept across the ballroom. Evan froze. "What are you talking about?" He whispered, his face pale. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a document folder, thick, stamped, legal. "I'm talking about Grant Holdings Trust, the company behind the company. The one your mother and I established in 1985. Evan blinked, panic flickering in his eyes. "That's impossible." "No," I said quietly. "That's oversight. Something Harvard apparently didn't teach." I turned back to the crowd. "This trust still holds 62% ownership of Grant Energy's assets, which means my son here doesn't have the legal authority to sell or merge anything without trustee approval." Reporters' cameras began flashing. Investors whispered to one another. Evan's fiancée tried to smile, but it faltered fast. "And since you all value transparency," I continued, "let me add one more detail. There's also a second will, one your mother wrote before she passed. Will number 2. Evan swallowed hard. "Dad, please don't." "But I already had the floor. According to that, will Evan Grant's inheritance and any leadership position is contingent upon proving he values people more than profits. Respect over reputation. Character over convenience." I placed the sealed copy on the podium. "So before you sign your $500 million deal, you might want to check who actually has the authority to bless it." Silence. The Titan global representatives were already packing their briefcases. I stepped closer to the mic, lowered my voice, and said, "The problem with building an empire on arrogant son is that when the truth shows up, it doesn't knock." Cameras snapped, Tiffany's eyes darted toward the exit, and Evan, my boy who thought he was untouchable, just stood there staring at the floor. I turned to leave, but before I stepped off the stage, I looked back once more. "You were right about one thing, Evan. The world doesn't run on grit anymore. That's why it keeps breaking." And with that, I walked out to the sound of whispers, shattered pride, and the quiet hum of justice catching up. I didn't go home after the gala. Instead, I drove to the old refinery, the one Evan had called outdated and unprofitable. Funny thing about oil rigs, they look quiet from the outside, but underneath, pressure's always building. The night air was cold. The moon hung low, reflecting off the steel tanks like liquid silver. I turned off the engine and just sat there listening to the hum of distant pumps still running on equipment I designed decades ago. Equipment that still worked, because some things built with integrity don't break easy. I leaned back in my seat and whispered, "Well, Grace, it's done." Somewhere I imagined her laughing softly the way she always did when she saw pride collapse under its own weight. I reached for the Bible she'd kept in the glove box, the same one with her handwriting along the edges. My hands trembled a bit as I flipped through the thin pages, and they stopped on Ecclesiastes 3:1. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. I read it out loud, slow enough for the wind to carry it. That verse had been our anchor during every storm. When oil prices crashed, when we almost lost our first home, when Grace got sick, it was always the same promise: God's timing isn't fast, but it's flawless. And tonight, that timing had arrived right on schedule. I didn't plan the gala. I didn't force the truth into the light. I just stood still long enough for God to move His own hand. That's the thing about divine justice. It doesn't come with noise. It comes with clarity. Evan had spent years believing that faith was weakness, that prayer was for men who had run out of options. He used to tease me about my Sunday habits. "Dad, do you really think God cares about oil rigs and drilling equipment?" And I'd tell him, "No, son. God doesn't care about the rigs. He cares about the men who sweat under them." I looked up at the dark sky and smiled. Guess he cared about this one too, huh? My phone buzzed. A message from Sarah, my attorney. Audit confirmed. Media picked up the story. "You're trending, Walter." Evan left the hotel early, looked broken. I typed back, "Don't humiliate him further. Let the dust settle. God's handling the rest." Because the truth is, no victory feels holy if it comes from spite. I stepped out of the truck boots, crunching against gravel, and walked toward the silent rig. The wind tugged at my jacket, cold and sharp, like a reminder that this wasn't the end, just the turning point. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying bitterness. I was carrying peace. Maybe that's what faith really is. Not waiting for miracles, but trusting that justice doesn't need your hands, only your patience. I sat on an overturned barrel, opened my old notebook, and began to write. Tonight, I saw arrogance fall. But I also saw my own reflection in it. Maybe pride runs both ways in the builder and the heir. Lord, help me teach, not destroy. I paused, thinking about my son. For all his faults, Evan wasn't evil, just blind. He'd been raised in comfort, never having to scrape, never having to pray, because the pantry was empty. His world had been made too easy. Maybe this was the only way he could ever understand what it means to earn something real. The refinery lights flickered, as if answering that thought. I closed my notebook, stood up, and faced the horizon. Dawn was starting to tint the clouds orange, the color of redemption. Lord, I said quietly, you gave me the strength to stand when I was cast out. Now give my boy the strength to kneel. The words hung in the air, drifting somewhere between prayer and promise. Because I knew this wasn't over yet. There was still one more chapter, one more lesson Evan had to learn. And God wasn't finished writing it. I got back in the truck, turned the key, and whispered to myself, time for the reckoning sun. By the time the sun came up over Houston, Grant, Energy wasn't just a company anymore. It was a headline. Every business channel was running the same story. CEO Evan Grant loses control after father reveals hidden trust. Legacy versus ambition, the fall of a modern heir. I didn't need to watch the news to know what it felt like for him. Pride doesn't just fall, it shatters. And when it does, it cuts the one who built it. At 8:00 a.m., my phone buzzed. Sarah, my attorney, He's outside the refinery gate, she said. Looks like he hasn't slept. I drove over. The same rusted sign still hung above the entrance. Grant Energy. Built, not bought. Evan stood there wearing the same tailored suit he'd worn to the gala, except now it was wrinkled, his tie loose. His eyes hollow. He looked less like a CEO and more like a boy who just realized money couldn't buy mercy. "Morning, son," I said, stepping out of the truck. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Finally, he said, "Dad." I messed up. I nodded slowly. "Yes, you did." He looked like he wanted me to yell to throw him out to punish him, but that would have been too easy. I motioned toward the gate. "Walk with me." We went inside. The smell of oil and dust filled the air. The clang of tools, the hum of machinery, the heartbeat of everything I'd ever built. "You remember this place?" I asked. He nodded. "Barely. You never let me come here when I was a kid. That's because I didn't want you seeing me crawl under machines at midnight just to keep payroll alive. I wanted you to dream higher." He looked around, taking it in for the first time like a museum exhibit of something he'd never valued. "Dad," he said quietly, "you embarrassed me in front of the whole city." I stopped walking. "No, son. I revealed you. There's a difference." He looked away. "I just wanted to make you proud. You can't make me proud by tearing down what I built to lift yourself higher." He didn't argue. He didn't even look angry anymore, just broken. I sighed and leaned against the railing. "Evan, your mother and I wrote that second will for a reason. We wanted to see what kind of man you'd be when power blinded you. And now we know." He swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" I took a deep breath. "Now comes the reckoning." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I pointed toward the shop floor. "You're going to work here. 6 months. No suits, no assistants, no cameras. Just steel grease and the man who built this place before you ever had a title." He blinked, confused. "You want me to be a laborer? I want you to understand what labor is. You talk about innovation, efficiency, sustainability, all those fancy words. But those words mean nothing if you don't know the sound of a wrench hitting steel or the weight of a day's work on your back." He ran a hand through his hair. "Dad, I don't even know how." "Good," I said. "That means you'll have to learn." He stared at me, searching for any sign that I might be joking. There wasn't one. I reached into my coat pocket and handed him a folded sheet of paper. He opened it slowly. "Grant Family Trust. Condition 2. Heir must complete a 6-month period of supervised labor and demonstrate comprehension of core company functions before assuming inheritance rights." "Your mother wrote that clause," I said softly. "Said no son of hers was going to inherit an empire he couldn't rebuild from scratch." He folded the paper and nodded silent. Then for the first time since he was a boy, I saw something real in his eyes. Not arrogance, not fear. Humility. "When do I start?" he asked. "Tomorrow, 6:00 a.m. Bring clothes you don't mind ruining." He gave a weak laugh. "Guess I don't have many of those." "Then go buy some. At Walmart. Not Prada." He almost smiled. As he walked away, I looked toward the horizon. The refinery chimneys rose into the pale sky like sentinels, old, battered, but still standing. "Lord," I whispered, "you took him down just far enough to look up. Now give him the strength to climb right this time." That prayer wasn't for revenge anymore. It was for redemption. Because as much as Evan needed to learn humility, I needed to learn mercy. And that's the hardest kind of reckoning there is. The next morning before sunrise, the refinery yard was alive with motion cranes, swinging engines, humming men shouting through the early fog. The smell of diesel and steel filled the air, sharp and heavy. And right in the middle of it all stood my son. Evan showed up at exactly 6:00 a.m., just like I told him. Only this time there was no chauffeur, no silk tie, no Rolex flashing in the light. He wore jeans too new to be real work pants, a plain gray t-shirt, and a pair of borrowed steel toe boots that looked like they were swallowing his feet. The men noticed immediately. Ray smirked. "Boss, you sure he's built for this?" I shrugged. "That's what we're here to find out." Evan looked nervous but tried to hide it. "Where do I start?" I handed him a hard hat and a pair of gloves, right where every man here did cleaning the sludge tanks. He blinked. "You're kidding. Son, you don't learn leadership from boardrooms. You learn it by understanding the work you're asking others to do." He nodded quietly. No argument this time. That was progress. By mid-morning, he was drenched in sweat and covered in grime. The Texas sun doesn't care about your education or your last name. It burns everyone the same. Ray handed him a wrench twice the size of his hand. "Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty," he said with a grin. Evan fumbled with it, dropped it cursed under his breath and tried again. By noon, his shirt was black with oil, his palms raw, and his back aching. He'd stopped checking his phone hours ago. It sat dead in his locker, forgotten. I watched from a distance. Every mistake he made, every wince, every sigh, it was the sound of pride breaking down into understanding. At lunch, he sat on a crate, gulping water like a man stranded in the desert. Hank tossed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Turkey," he said. "You'll live." Evan smiled weakly. "Thanks." "Don't thank me," Hank said. "Thank the guy who stayed up half the night fixing the fridge so your food didn't spoil." "That was you?" Evan asked. "Been me for 30 years, Hank replied, taking a bite. "You probably never knew my name till today." Evan didn't answer. He just looked down the silence, saying more than words could. Later that afternoon, I walked over to him as he was cleaning tools. "How's your first day?" He wiped his forehead. "Harder than I thought." "Good. That means you're doing it right." He hesitated. "Dad, those men. They don't talk much, but they watch," I said. "Always. Around here, respect isn't given with your title. It's earned with your effort." He nodded slowly, then surprised me by asking, "How long did you work like this before you made it?" I smiled. "Still working, son. Success doesn't mean you stop sweating. It just means you know why you're sweating." That night, I found him sitting in the workshop alone, staring at a half-assembled pump valve. "Can't figure it out?" I asked. He looked up, defeated. "No matter how I turn it, it leaks." I picked up a wrench, adjusted the angle slightly, and tightened one bolt. The leak stopped. Evan watched closely. "You make it look easy." "It's not easy," I said. "It's familiar." That's the difference between a man who studies work and a man who's lived it. He stayed late that night, working until his hands shook. I didn't stop him. By the end of the first week, the fancy wristwatch was gone, replaced by a thin layer of grime and humility. The other men started calling him kid instead of sir. And he didn't mind. He came home one evening exhausted and found me reading on the porch. "Dad," he said, sitting beside me, "I think I get it now." Get what? He paused. Why Mom wrote that clause. I looked at him for a moment. Tell me. She knew. I couldn't value what I hadn't earned. There it was, the first honest truth that had ever come out of his mouth in years. I nodded slowly. Son money can buy land, but not legacy. You can inherit a company, but not character. He stared at his hands, blistered, cut raw. Guess I'm learning the hard way. I chuckled softly. The hard way is the only way that sticks. That night after he went inside, I sat there alone staring at the refinery lights glowing against the horizon. Lord, I whispered, thank you for breaking him gently. Thank you for reminding him that calloused hands don't mean failure, they mean grace through work. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The bitterness that used to sit heavy on my chest was gone, replaced by something quieter, forgiveness. Because revenge can teach a man fear, but only grace can teach him wisdom. And I was finally watching my son become a man worth forgiving. 6 months later, Houston felt different. The air was colder, the days shorter, and the refinery yard, once a place of pride and pain, now felt alive again. Machines ran smoother, crews moved with rhythm, and laughter had found its way back into the break room. But the biggest change wasn't in the company. It was in my son. Evan no longer drove his Bentley to work. He came in a used Ford pickup, wore oil-stained jeans, and carried his lunch in a dented metal box like the rest of us. His hands, once soft as paper, were now calloused and scarred with little cuts that no Rolex could ever hide. He had learned to listen. He'd started asking questions instead of giving orders. He took advice from men he once looked down on. And when someone made a mistake, he didn't bark or posture, he helped fix it. The board had noticed. The workers had noticed. Even I couldn't deny it anymore. Now it was time for the final evaluation. At 10 a.m., we gathered in the main office, me, Sarah Keaton, our family attorney, Mike Roberts from the union, and Dr. Patricia Brown, an old friend from the Energy Commission, who'd agreed to sit on the evaluation board. Evan sat across the table, his shoulders squared, but humble, his eyes clear. Sarah opened her folder. Evan Grant, per the conditions set forth in Will Number 2, you've completed 6 months of supervised labor and management training under your father's oversight. Today, this board determines whether you've met the moral and professional conditions for reinstatement and inheritance. Are you ready? Evan nodded. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Brown leaned forward. Then tell us what you've learned, Mr. Grant. He took a breath, looked at his hands, and began. I used to think success was about control. That leadership meant being the loudest in the room, having the biggest deal, the newest technology. I thought my father's way was outdated. That hard work was something you outgrow once you get a diploma. He paused, his voice steady but low. But out there in that refinery, I saw what real intelligence looks like. It's not about numbers or buzzwords. It's knowing when to shut up and listen to someone who's done the job longer than you've been alive. He looked at me then. Dad, I used to think you were holding me back. Now I know you were holding me up. The room went still. Mike Roberts cleared his throat. So what would you say leadership means now? Evan smiled faintly. It means earning the right to be followed, not demanding it. Dr. Brown nodded approvingly. And what will you do differently if reinstated? I'll keep the company's soul intact, he said. We'll still innovate, but we'll never sell out our people again. Grant Energy will stay a place where hard work isn't just respected, it's remembered. Sarah looked at me. Walter, anything you'd like to add? I leaned back in my chair, studying the man in front of me. Just this, I said. You finally sound like the man your mother prayed you'd become. His eyes softened. She'd be proud of you too. For a moment I couldn't speak. Grace's absence filled the room like a gentle echo. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. The board votes unanimously Evan Grant has fulfilled the terms of Will Number 2. Effective immediately, he is reinstated as co-executor of the Grant Family Trust. Evan stood, but instead of celebrating, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed Sarah a sealed envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "My refusal," he said simply. "I'm not ready to inherit." "Not yet." I frowned. "Evan, what are you doing?" He turned to me. "Dad, I don't want to live off what you built. I want to build something with you. Something new." "What do you have in mind?" I asked. He smiled a real smile, not the polished kind. "Renewables. Clean energy. Using what we know to power what's next. We can call it Grant Renewables. Half of our profits go to scholarships for young engineers. And a portion," he looked down for a moment, then up again, "a portion goes to the Grace Grant Foundation for women battling lung disease. In her honor." My throat tightened. "You already filed this yesterday," he said. "Didn't want to ask for permission until I'd earned your trust back." Sarah wiped her eyes. "Well, Mr. Grant Sr., looks like your boy learned something after all." I laughed through the lump in my throat. Guess the hard way worked. Evan extended his hand. "Partners." I stood and gripped it firmly. Partners. And just like that, for the first time in years, we weren't father and son locked in a power struggle. We were two men finally walking the same road. As the meeting ended, Dr. Brown stopped by the door. "Walter," she said, "you didn't just build a company. You built a man. Don't forget that." When everyone left, I sat alone for a while, looking out the window at the refinery, my old kingdom still breathing, still alive. "Lord," I whispered, "thank you for keeping your promise. You broke him, but you rebuilt him stronger. And in the process, you rebuilt me too." That's the thing about redemption. It doesn't just save the fallen, it softens the hardened. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just proud of my son. I was grateful for the way God had written our story. A few months later, the refinery smelled different. Not of oil or metal, but of new paint and fresh hope. The old Grant Energy sign had been replaced with one that read, "Grant Renewables, built on faith powered by hands." Evan came up with that tagline himself. We were standing side by side on the catwalk overlooking the yard. The morning light bounced off the steel, and for the first time in years, I saw my son, not as the arrogant heir who'd betrayed me, but as the man who'd finally found his purpose. He held a clipboard smudged with oil and ink and laughed. "Never thought I'd say this, Dad, but I actually miss the smell of diesel now." I smiled. "Careful, son. That's how it starts. First you respect the work, then you fall in love with it." He laughed again this time, not for appearances, not for cameras, just honest, joyful laughter. It was the sound of redemption. That afternoon, we held the dedication ceremony for the new Grace Grant Foundation. The whole crew gathered under the Texas sun, shoulder to shoulder, old roughnecks, new engineers, and even executives who'd once doubted us. A local pastor read a verse that Grace had underlined in her old Bible, one that had guided her through every storm. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. James 4:10. As the words echoed through the yard, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Because humility isn't weakness, it's the soil where wisdom grows. When the prayer ended, Evan took the microphone. He didn't look nervous this time, just grateful. My mother believed in second chances, he began. She believed that faith isn't about never falling, it's about what you do when you hit the ground. My father built this company with his hands. I almost destroyed it with my pride. But God used my failure to rebuild me, to teach me that the greatest inheritance isn't money or power, it's grace. He turned toward me. Dad, thank you for teaching me what no classroom ever could. The men applauded. A few even wiped their eyes. And for the first time since Grace passed, I let mine fall freely too. Not from pain, but from pride of the truest kind. After the ceremony, everyone drifted back to work. The yard grew quiet again. I stayed behind, sitting on a steel crate, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold. I thought about how far we'd come from betrayal and arrogance to forgiveness and faith. And I finally understood God never took anything from me. He just rearranged it. He turned loss into lesson and pain into purpose. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of oil and sage-grass. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for breaking us gently and building us stronger." A moment later, I heard footsteps. Evan walked over carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You didn't think I'd let you drink alone, did you?" I chuckled. "You even remembered how I take it." He smiled, black, strong enough to keep the angels awake. We sat there together, father and son, partners at last. He looked out toward the rigs. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" I nodded. "She already is. She's just watching from better seats." We didn't talk much after that. Some moments don't need words. Then Evan said quietly, "You know, you were right all along. The real education isn't something you pay for. It's something you live for." I smiled. "Now you sound like your old man." Before I close this story, let me ask you something. If this journey spoke to your heart, if you believe that wisdom, faith, and redemption still matter in today's world, share this story with someone who needs it. And don't forget to follow this channel so you never miss another story about family faith and the fight to reclaim what truly matters. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting everything in soft orange light. Evan took a deep breath and said, "Dad, you know what's crazy? I used to think your calloused hands were a symbol of struggle. Now I see they're proof of strength." I looked down at my palms, scarred, lined, and steady. Then I looked at his. They matched. I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "You finally earned it, son." He smiled. "Earned what's your name?" We walked back toward the refinery lights as the machines hummed to life behind us. The sound wasn't just mechanical anymore, it was a hymn. A song about forgiveness, about work that matters, and about faith that endures. Because some lessons can't be bought, some blessings can't be begged for, and some stories, the ones worth telling, are built by hand.